Greetings and welcome. Excited to be with everyone today. Hopefully everybody is coming to the room and loading on in. We have a great opportunity to talk about some amazing things that we can do to shift culture, shift mindset, and just operationalize what we're talking about equity in a space in higher education around career services, but also with our employer development and opportunity to partner with our employers at getting better around this whole idea of diversity, equity, inclusion. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Tierney Bates, along with my colleague, Roderick Lewis. We're both at UNC Chapel Hill. And today, we're going to present an opportunity for you to see a new format and scorecard that has been created to help organizations from our employer relations side of the house impact what employers are saying they're doing. And at the same time, it is for employers to understand how they become their best selves. So we're going to get into operationalizing equity, developing a diversity scorecard for employers. So bear with us. We're going to be excited to present this to you. And I think it's going to be a game changer as we discuss this and go more into detail overall. So if we go to the next slide, I really want to dive into this idea that what has happened over the last couple months or in the last year, we've been in two pandemics. Obviously, the pandemic of COVID, which has hit us very hard in multiple different ways. And then we've been in the pandemic of racial injustice. And how do we come out of both of these pandemics is key to all of us on this call today, key to our institutions, key to our employers, and key to this country. So it's important for us to understand that in this basis, in this framework, we have to do a deeper dive in some of this work that we're doing. And that's why Roderick Lewis has developed this great scorecard for employers, for career services offices to help navigate some of the questions you've had over the last couple of months as your student affairs, wherever you're housed at, your campus has determined to impact more on your students of color population, or how to work with employers to increase diversity pipelines overall to help people be better about the employment. But it's not just about the employment of our students. It is also educating the culture of our employers that we work with that can be very homogenous. And as I tell a lot of organizations that I've either consulted with and worked with, you sometimes have to turn the mirror on yourself to understand that, yes, you can hire a lot of people that look like me. That doesn't mean you will retain me. That doesn't mean I walk into a culture that is really embracing me, my identity, and the intersectionality of what I am a cultural add to your organization. So we're going to get into a couple different things. One, we're going to expand what student and employer engagement opportunities are out there from a learning objective standpoint. We want to expand the ideas on how to create a metric system to improve Black, historically disadvantaged groups with their interactions with employers to address recruitment, retention, corporate trauma, because there is a trauma around this, and create a top 25 and 50 companies list for DEI. Now, I know you probably say, Tierney, trauma? Yes. If you understand what Dr. Acker has written about inequity regimes in corporate and higher education, the DNA of our country, the DNA of our organizations that have been founded, you have to think about it. They've all been founded and processed and developed without me in mind. That means higher education as a whole, when it first was founded, was to educate clergy and educate white males. Here we are, fast forward in the year 2020, and it still has not lived up to its full potential in including me and in asking me to be a part of this versus me having to assimilate in a lot of different ways. We want to expand the use of data and metrics and insight into best practices and strategies to support employer DEI efforts and improve inclusion, justice, and belonging. I'll say this, I'm unapologetically Black. Why? Because we know that even though I don't want to get into oppression Olympics, one of those groups that has really been seen it, and we've seen it with the death of George Floyd this year, is that the disadvantages and those things that have been in place for Black folks have been one of those things that we truly, truly have to address. And we can't just keep hiring folks into our organizations. We can't just push our students into these organizations, not understanding the trauma that they may have come from, the trauma of what's going on within that organization from an inequity regime, but also the ability to understand that overall, these things impact our students, they impact our recruitment process, and they impact an organization's retention. Now, the status quo, as I said, is not acceptable anymore. We can no longer say what Wells Fargo CEO has said, is that I can't find top Black talent. He should have called me, I could have gave him 10 people off the top of my head. It is important for us to understand that less than 1% of our Fortune 500 CEOs are Black. All of us on this call today have really lived in the time that we saw our first Black CEO. So if you're over the age of 35, in that time age range, 35 and plus, you have seen only in your lifetime the first Black CEO. So that goes to tell you what much more work we have to do overall. Not only that, we have to think about women, our Latinx community as far as that is concerned. And so again, these are the things that we have to really address at that level. 3.2% of executives at the senior management level are African-American. Again, I tell you, there is talent all around you. The key around the talent is, what are you looking for? As I break down, we always talk about fit. I keep saying, let's get rid of the word fit and let's look at a cultural add. It's important for us to understand that, and this is what the scorecard will give us an idea to focus more on. We know that 58% of Blacks indicated they feel racism on their jobs. Yes, I have felt it myself. I know people will look at me like, no, Terry, not you. Yes, why? Because there are idiosyncrasies and implicit biases that go along with some things that we have been trained. Why do you think the most segregated day in America is on Sundays in the church? Why do you think neighborhoods are still segregated, school systems, all these other great things? They exist, and we are part of the problem. If you think about it overall, 38% of Black millennials, those born between 1981 and 1995, say they're considering leaving their jobs to start their own company. Why? It's because, again, our organizations are not truly helping our that cultural add, and it's more like assimilation. A prime example, as I talk to you today with my Wolverine meets Frederick Douglass haircut and look, why do I not be able to show up like this versus what has an ideology says what I should be or what I should look like when I come into your space overall? And a lot of startups and a lot of different companies are starting to get that and recognize that overall. And we know that Black men are paid 13% less than white women, but Black women are paid so much more less than any other group from that perspective on the dollar. And so if there's any group that needs to be addressed during the scorecard opportunity, it is Black women. We know that because they're the highest, most educated group coming along from a subpopulation, and they are game changers in America right now, we've seen in the political landscape. So it's important for us no longer to have excuses, but to be able to move forward for our organizations to have the best and brightest be able to go on into these opportunities as long as that is concerned. Now, if we look at our current state overall, professionals who are Black, employees who have to work harder for advancement. I was taught this, and if you don't have a Black colleague that you work with or someone that you have a conversation with, you should. Why? I was taught this growing up, that you got to work twice as hard, they get as half as much. Yes, if you never heard that before, you should have watched Papa Pope on the Scandal. He said that, and that was the truth. And most people that look like me will nod their head and say yes. Now, for a lot of my colleagues that don't look like me, you're probably first time hearing this and saying to yourself, really? Yes. Why? If you have to look at the historical perspective of redlining, the historical perspective of education, the historical perspective of all the different things, it was always a stopgate, and also to this day, ways that were put in place where people of color could not advance to a certain level. So if we look at overall from that perspective versus professionals who tend to leave their current companies within 2 years, you look at that. It's going to be huge. Why? I'm seeing it even in my field of higher education, that more and more Blacks are considering leaving the field and going to work in other spaces, because we still have not figured out how to create a truly inclusive, belonging community moving forward. And if they're planning to leave and start their own ventures, great. I want to see the next Mark Zuckerberg, the next Jeff Bezos, the next Steve Jobs in some regards, as far as that's concerned, because that also means that they will go hire more and more people that will look like me to help uplift my community, but also uplift the different things we need in our society as a whole. So overall, these are some things that we have to really think about from a corporate America standpoint, how much underrepresented employees we have in certain spaces, and how we always say, well, we can't find them. No, the problem was from a historical data, we were always stopgates that we didn't let people get to where they needed to be. Now we have to play the catch-up game, and we have to right historical wrongs. If we look at our current state overall, from entry level to manager to senior manager, all the way up to the C-suite, as you can see right there, it gets smaller and smaller based upon men of color and women of color. And I've said it before, if there's any subgroup that should be more dedicated to more people having conversation. It's women of color. They are executive leaders. I've experienced it even with my own wife in a lifetime, who is an amazing leader herself, but doesn't get the opportunities that her colleagues that don't look like her get from a lot of different perspectives. Some of that is mentorship. Some of that is the ability to not to be in the right spaces or have the right connections. And so it's important for us to understand that based upon this McKinsey report, women in the workplace really are the driver. They are, I talked to KeyBank last month, and they hired more, 67% of their new hires were women, but only less than 12% were Black women. So again, there's one thing we have to talk about is how do we support women, but also subpopulations of that women group moving forward. Today, Roderick is going to introduce you to a scorecard that will dive deeply into 27 different dimensions. And it's not just your basic scorecard. It has a basic level to it, but then we have 2 more advanced levels that truly take you to a level to turn the mirror on yourself, like I said, for employers to really true. I'll give you an example. Some employers have already started, we started with this, testing it, have said, hey, yeah, you know what, we have some of this data. But we're asking them to go a little deeper dive into that data to truly turn that mirror on themselves. And some of them are finding out like, wow, we have some of this data we don't own. So that lets them know what are they doing best practice-wise and what are new things they need to address. Number 2, we realize also in that is that some of that information is not public, right? And I get it. Some organizations don't want to share what their diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like in some regards because maybe it's not that great, but it gives them a framework to work on. And if you want to be very transparent, you want to be like, hey, I want to hire, I'm about the diversity and inclusion, I want to increase X, Y, and Z, supplier diversity, staffing, all this other stuff, put it out there. Put it out there where you are, and then you hold yourself accountable to move an organization forward. And third, communication. From the top down is very important when it comes to this work, as far as I'm concerned. We've all talked to some employers, and we know that some of them are discombobulated when it's trying to collect this information because there's no top-down way to that everybody in the organization knows what your diversity, equity, inclusion platform or strategic plan looks like and can understand how you get to those numbers or metrics or outcomes that you truly want overall. Well, guess what? This is what Roderick Lewis is about to teach you right now with your scorecard. And it's going to give you an opportunity as employers on this call today, as career development specialists on this call today, to work with us here at UNC to learn more about what we're doing and how we're creating this top 25, top 50 list to help our students understand what are the companies that truly are saying they're about diversity, equity, inclusion, and not at the surface level. Let's truly go deep. Let's not go past, let's go past just the hires. Let's just go past people in executive offices. Let's talk about your corporate responsibility. Let's talk about your HR practices. Let's talk about all these different things that this scorecard will tell you today. And I'm going to turn it over to Roderick.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bates, for that wonderful introduction and for really giving a high-level overview of the genesis of how this scorecard was created and, more importantly, why it was created. And so without further ado, I want to just jump into one more current state slide and look at where we are in a couple of companies that I benchmarked. And when you're looking at data, what you have to do is more important to look at this aggregated data. And so many of you may not be aware that PricewaterhouseCoopers for the first time released their, what they call their DEI transparency report. And over the past 15 years or so, I've been looking at this information, DEI reports and company websites, annual reports, and really looking at how organizations present this data from a communication and management standpoint. But I want you to look at this where we are with Cisco and PricewaterhouseCoopers. And when you look at your historically disadvantaged groups, what I'm specifically talking about is your Black and Hispanic population. And what you want to look at here, in both instances, that number is very, very small when we get up into the management and upper levels of leadership. So at PwC, for example, you have 2% Black African American at the managing director level, and at the director level is 3%. And the same thing over here with Cisco. When you look at their percentage of U.S. managers, you're looking at 4.8% for Hispanics and 2.2% for Black. And so again, building off of what Tierney said, here are opportunities when you're speaking with an organization or trying to understand, how do they measure, how do they gauge, proportionality? What do they look at in terms of what equitable outcomes should look like in terms of these different levels of leadership within their organization? More importantly, how can career services professionals advocate for better employer DEI transparency and accountability? And that is the question that I put forth to everyone on this webinar today. It's the question that we also put on ourselves, at UNC Chapel Hill in our Career Center. So to give you a little background on the scorecard, and from this moment forward, I'm going to refer to it by its true name, which is the Employer Anti-Racism and Gender Equality Scorecard. So the code name was the Diversity Scorecard, but as we all know, diversity is just a catch-all phrase, and it tells you everything and it tells you nothing in some cases. So we're going to go and call it what it is. And this scorecard is the Employer Anti-Racism and Gender Equality Scorecard. So I'm going to give you a little background of its creation. And you have to understand from an employer perspective, most employers use some iteration of a balanced scorecard, right? And so that's how they organize their operations, their resources, their capital in order to achieve their business objectives through any myriad number of processes, right? And so everything within an organization and employer is going to take into account these four perspectives, which are financial, customer, internal process, and learning and growth perspectives. And then you have to understand from an academic institution level, post-secondary institution, you have to understand what an equity scorecard is. And with the equity scorecard, it also has four perspectives built on a balanced scorecard framework. And those four perspectives of access, retention, institutional receptivity, and excellence, they also are very important in terms of how a post-secondary institution supports historically disadvantaged groups as they enter into the institution, as they choose specific types of majors or certain types of majors, as they navigate through prerequisite courses, as they have access to certain types of experiential learning or career opportunities. All these things are what an academic institution looks at when they are using some iteration of an equity scorecard. Both of those connect to what I call our community. Right? And the community is where we talk about our socio-economic and racial justice, because this is where the wellspring of systemic inequities come from. And the employers and academic institutions, there's an interplay between them and the community, and the way they work with this community, which is inclusive of a number of agencies and institutions and government support for historically disadvantaged groups. The interplay is going to determine outcomes for these groups of students and people. Now, the Employer Anti-Racism and Gender Equality Scorecard, it is the connector, it is the bridge, right? So we sit at this type of bridge place between the academic component of the universities in which we sit, but also within the connection to employers and career opportunities, right? And so having that bridge and having that understanding of this framework allows us to be able to look at employers, right? And understand, as Tierney spoke about, the transparency level that they have in making certain data available for consumption, for evaluation, right? Now, transparency of data is different than accountability of data. And so the scorecard does look at both, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm only going to focus on the transparency of data. But accountability of data is completely different, and that's a different way that you would have to approach that. And it's going to be organization by organization, because it's a little more difficult to compare the accountability of vastly different organizations. But I want you to understand that this scorecard, it is really, in my opinion, the missing piece to this puzzle in terms of this new calling that I believe that Career Center professionals have, because we have to go a step further now. There's a lot more that we have to do other than just transactional, making sure our students get hired into organizations. So you saw the previous slides, you heard what Tierney talked about. Academic trauma is real. And so what we want to avoid is that, hey, these students are jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. So imagine students going through microaggressions and all sorts of discrimination in general. I'm not saying every student, I'm just saying in general, when you disaggregate the data, you're going to see that historically disadvantaged groups experience a lot more of microaggressions and certain types of inequities and expectations from their faculty, and access to certain classes or access to scholarships within their institutions. And the last thing we want to do is send them on their merry way into an organization that is also going to repeat that in the form of corporate trauma, okay? So I want to show you one more slide. And I want to ask the question, what is anti-racism and gender equality? Now, see, you have to understand what that is before you can really appreciate the value of this scorecard. And so, as Stephen Covey says, you have to seek first to understand. Now, you look at this graphic here, and you start thinking about, if we look at poverty and we break it down by race and age, let's, just focus on race. And if you focus on that in terms of understanding, disproportionate outcomes and inequities, you see that in every indicator, Blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented in these indicators of poverty. Okay, everyone, whether it's age or whatever, we are overrepresented. Okay, and so then you have to start asking yourself, why is that? What led to that? And until you go down that rabbit hole, you're not going to really be able to have what I call is the education and empathy to be able to unlock the keys of empowerment, equality, and equity for these historically disadvantaged groups. But I can't teach you that. Dr. Bates can't teach you that. We can't do that in a 1-hour presentation. That's going to be a personal journey that you as an individual has to take, or that your career center will have to take, or your entire institution, and even extending to your community outside of your professional workplace. But I can give you some guidelines, but I can't give you a prescription of, hey, if you just do this, you'll understand that. It's a personal journey that all of us are, myself included. I always tell people, yes, I am Black, I'm African-American, but I wasn't born with a Black history gene, right? So it's not like I just came out the womb just quoting, Malcolm X and, spitting, all sorts of things about Black history and understanding the sources of racism all over the world. No, I had to educate myself too. And it's just a journey that we all have to take. So seek first to understand. Research the history of racism and sexism in the US, all right? You have to do that. If you really want to understand how to use any type of scorecard, but more importantly, this anti-racism and gender equality scorecard for what it's going to be designed for, you have to do that. You have to challenge assumptions and long-held beliefs. You got to do that, all right? So once you start educating yourself, you're going to have to understand, hey, what assumptions do you probably hold or have you held? And then you got to ask some very deep and powerful questions. How do you know what beliefs need challenging, right? Because every belief you may feel doesn't need to be challenged, but you got to be able to understand through the education, what are things that you may need to challenge, whether internally or externally. You got to take a position of advocacy and allyship, okay? And you got to ask, what do those words mean personally for you, and what changes will you need to make? Now, these things are race agnostic. This is for everybody, okay? Finally, individually, as an office, as an institution, as a community, you have to commit to racial equity and social justice. Without this final piece, then what you're going to be doing is more of a performative act. You're going to be doing more transparency, more transactional work. And what I'm building here is more transformative work, right? And that transformation starts with yourself. So you got to figure out what type of commitment you're going to make, and then how you're going to evaluate that progress. So now I want to present to you the basic standard framework of the scorecard, okay? So what you see here is a blank version, and I'm going to show you a version that's a little more filled out. But I wanted to show you the 4 perspectives: people and inclusive leadership, retention and advancement, campus engagement and recruitment, and community and social impact. These are the 4 perspectives that do not change. This is the guide. This is how you're going to use, this is the lens through which you will view and filter organizations, okay? In terms of evaluating just where they are on transparency of data. And I'm going to keep repeating that because I want people to understand that this is not a tool that's designed to be punitive or naming and shaming. It is purely, we're just evaluating what you as an organization has either made public or what you are willing to share upon request, so that we can understand where you are in these 4 perspectives. Now, this scorecard was designed based on hundreds of hours of research, meaning understanding business perspectives, understanding data that organizations typically make available, and even data that they don't make available. And then understanding how to evaluate and measure that data so that you have something that can be used across any number of organizations, okay? So just real quick, just so you understand what these color-coded perspectives mean, if you want to look at the top 2, and the order in which they are is very important as well, okay? So usually we would start from the bottom up in terms of how an organization builds its community, or builds its brand, or builds its impact to support historically disadvantaged groups. But for purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to start at the top just from an explanation standpoint. So we look at people and inclusive leadership and retention and advancement. I want you to think about those 2 being internal to the organization, right? These are things that the organization can control. External to the organization, here's where we come in. we're the yellow section, this campus engagement and recruitment perspective. So we're this is our academic institution section. This is us as career center professionals where we sit. And then this bottom piece is the community and social impact. And this is really the foundation of the scorecard, right? This is the foundation. This is where everything else is built upon. Because if you don't have the community and social impact perspective, everything else is going to crumble. And I want to show you what that looks like, okay? So I'll go through this real quick. I'll leave it up here so you can read it. But just understanding when I'm talking about people in inclusive leadership, what am I talking about? Well, very broadly, this is going to be looking at the indicators of equity, of organizations, indicators of equity in its representation, and more importantly, respect for its internal historically disadvantaged groups, okay? From entry level to board level. Retention and advancement. What am I talking about there? Well, I'm talking about analyzing the organization's indicators of equity in professional outcomes for its internal historically disadvantaged groups through its leadership development, succession planning, and diversity training, okay? So it's very inclusive, and it's designed as such because you're able to put some things in there. Now, I left this part blank intentionally because I want to communicate to you as an audience, this is not a prescriptive tool. See, what Roderick Lewis put together for those benchmarks may not be what Dr. Bates puts together or you put together for your career center. It's going to be very different based on what you want to put together as benchmarks that break down these perspectives, okay? So I want to reiterate that because when I show you the benchmarks I have in terms of ones that I said, hey, here's the ones I want to look at within this perspective, those are just ones that I chose, but you may choose totally different ones. I want to make sure you know that this is not a prescriptive tool. The tool would be blank like this. The rubrics themselves, I had to custom make every one of those rubrics, right? It takes a long time. If you've ever made rubrics, it takes a long time to make a rubric and to test the rubric and to validate a rubric, right? Because you got to get it right. Otherwise, it can't be used from an operational standpoint, okay? You can't just give it to some interns and say, hey, I want you to evaluate these 50 or 100 companies. If the rubric isn't right, you're not going to be able to do it because you're going to get 20 different outcomes for the same thing, and you don't want that. So you want some standardization, right? The weighting, that's up to you. You decide what weight you want to add on to each of these benchmarks based on what you individually or your career center or your institution believes is important as you evaluate organizations. Another thing I want to talk about before I move on is when you're using a scorecard, you're going to use it more for when you're trying to evaluate organizations for specific purposes. For example, if you're trying to put organizations in front of a DEI group, historically disadvantaged group of students, where you want to make sure that these employers have some type of activity, positive activity going in their DEI space, okay? All right, so here's what an example looks like. Here's one that when the benchmarks are filled out. Okay, and so this is the standard version when I talked about, looking at, transparency analysis too. All right, so we're using the 4 perspectives as a guide. Benchmarks, customizable. The measures are customizable. Everything breaking down into 3. So like I said here before, if you look at the bottom here, you got 4 perspectives, 12 benchmarks. And you can have more benchmarks if you want. I just do 3 per perspective. So I have 12 benchmarks. Each benchmark breaks down into 3 subcategories as well, what I call criteria. And then each of those criteria break down into 108 measures. And those final measures at granular level, that is looking at the actual breakdown of women, Blacks, and Hispanics, okay? And I'll show an example of that as we progress. So again, here we are with the card a little more fleshed out with some data here so that you can understand when I say people in inclusive leadership, when I'm looking at your senior leadership demographics, I'm looking at your general workforce demographics, and I'm looking at what evidence is there for commitment to a fair and respectful workplace. If you do the research, if you understand what, why this is important, then you understand why I put that information there. When I talk about retention and advancement, how do I break that down in terms of the benchmarks? What am I actually measuring? Where here from my perspective, I'm looking at what type of accountability and training do you have around DEI in your organization, and what types of historically disadvantaged affinity groups do you have? And then more importantly, what type of leadership development programs do you have for people that are from these historically disadvantaged groups? Because all that plays into retention, right? And it plays into advancement, right? Which then feeds into the people and inclusive leadership perspective. So as you can see, like this little layer cake, this is how they build on each other, right? Then we go back to where we are in the yellow, right? The campus and engagement perspective. And we have a key role in getting these students into the retention and advancement section, right? Because this is where they hire, right? So they hire them, and then once in the organization, now the organization has to figure out how to retain them. But then if we look back and we go a step down to the community and social impact, and you see what that's consisting of, that's looking at your K through 12 education programs, the social justice programs, supplier diversity and entrepreneurship program. All of this is what feeds into the university, right? This is what feeds into the system where we are able to then engage with them. So this is how I define them. And so when you're looking at this scorecard, it's more than just a business case for diversity. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not a fan of the business case for diversity, but that's another presentation. But really, skewing more towards a social justice case for diversity. I think it was the CEO from Merck. He said a couple of years ago, he said, there really isn't a business case to hire white males. So why do we have this, business case, to hire women or the quote unquote, people of color or, what is this business case? There's not a business case to hire a white male. And so, when you look at it from that perspective, yeah, that's very true. Like nobody's running around here with a business case for that. And it's important to look at, like I said, you have to have the disaggregated data on race and gender. And you don't see that on this iteration of the scorecard, but there's one that I have that's more expansive, and it does break down that granular detail. And again, I want to repeat that these metrics, they're only coming from public data that the organization either already has on their website through a number of reports that you would have to scrub and find unless the organization is kind enough to send them to you upon request. I've had organizations tell me they don't have that data. And then I'm like, well, but I'm looking at it right now, I have it. I was just asking you, did you want to send anything additional? But I've already have it. I'm just, and so what you'll find is sometimes employers or people you're talking to don't even realize that they have the data, that they even make it public. And again, that's an opportunity for education. That's an opportunity for you to advise that organization and help them understand how that information can be useful from a communication strategy to attract the very groups of employees that they say they want to, but also to look at what are they communicating about their workplace if they want to retain this group of students and employees, right? So it's very important that you also be able to serve in an advisory role to employers and trying to help shape their policies and practices within the workplace based on data, best practices that you are able to observe. And the key part is the rubrics. You got to really make sure those are calibrated and validated, or it's not going to work. Okay. So again, the strategic framework integrated with equity scorecards and balance scorecard. Also got some SWOT analysis and gap analysis sprinkled in as well. Okay. So if you look at this, what I want you to think about is, like I told you, the retention and the people in inclusive leadership perspective, those top two, those are internal to the organization. So for those of you who like SWOT analyses, this is perfect for you, because you say, hey, with the organization, I can evaluate, hey, what are some of their strengths and weaknesses within this space, internal to the organization. External to the organization, here's where you come in. As a career center, as an institution, as a university, you say, hey, we're outside of your organization. So what opportunities do you have with us? What are threats, through the lens from the perspective of the employer as it pertains to their support for these historically disadvantaged groups? What are these employers doing in the community that could, show how they're supporting these historically disadvantaged groups? So you're going to be using a lot of strategic frameworks. That's why I said this is not a transactional tool. It is really a transformative tool that's meant to do in collaboration as a group with different types of teams, with cross-functional teams, and even in collaboration with organizations. Now, this graphic to the right, I want you to think of an ecosystem. And as we have used this as an evaluation tool for holistic DEI activities, you got to look at our place, as I alluded to earlier. You got to think about the academic institution, the university, the employer, and the community. And you have to look at the inequities that arise in each place. So you have your socio-economic inequities, which lead to academic inequities, which lead to professional inequities, and then it just cycles back around, okay? That's very important to take this outside in view, right? Now, in the center of all this, now we're looking through the lens of historically disadvantaged groups. Through the center, right? So we got to center education, entrepreneurship, employment, and economic mobility through the lens of historically disadvantaged groups. So these inequities, right, they may be external in terms of on this graphic, but they are the ones that produce these inequities in education, entrepreneurship, employment, and economic mobility for historically disadvantaged groups. And so we can play an important role in helping organizations and our own academic institutions provide the necessary support that can provide some type of restorative, processes or practices, some remediation to support these groups of students. But if you don't understand the history here, right? When I talked about the history of racism, the history of sexism, then you're not going to be able to understand the interplay of these institutions on these four key points. And so we want to look at ecosystem solutions. We're not trying to do things in isolation. You have to work in concert, not only with your academics, in the university, but also with your corporate space as well, all right? And the corporate space and the academics, they are doing work in the community. So your role is to bridge the two and evaluate and see what are they doing to truly make change, to move the needle as we talk about anti-racism and gender equality. All right, so now let's get into the data, all right? So I've talked long enough about the background of the scorecard. You want to see some data. I love data. So I'm gonna take you real quickly through these next few slides. This is a scoring, method that I use, but you make your own. And I just want to show you an example that, we're not just scoring just willy-nilly. You have to kind of, get some data to understand. When we talk about transparency, I'm only at transparency, only looking at the absence of or the presence of data, okay? So when you think about that, these next slides, it'll make sense. The company research, we looked at, the Fortune 100 companies, the best places to work, all these companies that are, considered best places to work. We looked at that, but more importantly, we really looked at the companies who had attended prior diversity initiatives or events or activities on our campus. And that's where you really want to start, okay? So you want to identify the low-hanging fruit. And then in terms of analytics, we're using for now Excel and pivot tables, but we also want to eventually graduate to Tableau so that we can get more a visual graphic and more comparative analysis when we're looking at companies, comparing them to their peer group and then compare them to companies that are outside of their peer group. The research categories, this is just a few, but research, organizations' DEI programs, their partnerships in the community and partnerships with other institutions. You're looking at, their promotions and you're looking at, different practices. You're looking at their people distribution. You're looking at their philosophy. I mean, there's like 12 different categories, but I just want to give you a taste of the level of analysis in terms of that you are research in order to get down to a distilled number of categories that you can, manage from an operational standpoint, okay? So what you see is this is a spreadsheet where we track some of that data, and this is only looking at the people and inclusive leadership perspective. So just to give you an example of what it looks like. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I wanna now show you some graphics, okay? I looked at some tech firms, and so I thought it's important. I said, let me just show everybody what that looks like from a benchmarking and data analysis with our tech firms. And again, looking at transparency. And so what you see here from a board of directors demographics, which is how I define our senior leadership, DEI. Well, the only company that had some data was Cisco. Now, when you look at these zeros, that doesn't mean that there are no Blacks and African American. It just means that either they didn't have, like, the data just wasn't there. I couldn't find it, right? And so oftentimes you make a request to an organization for them to send it, or you just kind of Google and look at, you got a hard, hack it, so to speak, and say, well, let me just look at where your board and I'll just like count. But then that's not the method I want to do. I want to look at, do they make it available, easily and readily available in a numerical, quantifiable form to where I don't have to go hunt through 12 different reports just to find that data, okay? And so again, when you're looking at these ones and zeros and twos and threes, go back to look at this right here, which you won't remember, but zero means no data was available or is not provided by the organization. But that doesn't mean that it just doesn't exist. It just means that you can't find it. And if you can't find it, then the student who's looking for it, they can't find it either. And so that's the genesis of this scorecard. If you look at the executives, now you're a lot better there in terms of the way, most organizations define their executive demographics. And then you have a little more parity across the board in terms of data that's made available. And then on down to your VPs and directors, again, you see a little more parity in terms of a little more representation in terms of the data that organizations make available. That's from a transparency standpoint. Now on the right side, same titles, but now we're looking at accountability. So I do want to show you that I do look at accountability. It's just there's a certain way I have to treat that. But with accountability, you can see that Cisco has 20% women at their board of directors, and then you go down to the other metrics, and you can see that with Black and African American, you see that Microsoft has 2.7%, and then Hispanic 4.7%. But Cisco for Hispanic has 15%. And again, this is not to compare them in terms of saying, hey, well, Microsoft should be where Cisco is. It's just to understand where that organization is, okay? When you look at their accountability and then understanding, do they have some strategies in place where they're trying to increase that number or get it to whatever proportional outcome they feel it should be at based on however they define proportionate, equitable outcomes, okay? And then on the far right side here, you see this color coded spectrum. Well, I created this so you have a visual to kind of see like, hey, where are these organizations are benchmarking? And there's no bad, it's just where you are on the spectrum. Because if you're on this dark red spectrum, that means you're below this benchmark for that particular category. Then that just means, hey, there's a different type of conversation I can have with you as an organization to help you figure out what are some ways that you can make your data more transparent to move the needle, okay? You have to have transparency of data before you can even have accountability. So that's why that transparency is very important. And then having that data disaggregated is even more important. A lot of times organizations will just have things grouped under, we have 20% leaders that are from underrepresented groups, but they don't disaggregate it. Or they'll have the people of color, or they just say from diverse communities. Well, that doesn't tell me anything about the granular detail of Blacks and Hispanics, which are your historically disadvantaged groups when we're talking about the US reference. Here's Microsoft versus PC, PwC, just in terms of a lot of the data that's transparent. As you can see, PwC was just pretty transparent across the board. They probably did one of the more extensive diversity transparency reports that I've ever seen. But there's some other ones that I would really say, hey, these are held in high regard in terms of just the level of transparency. But they made a lot of data bare, which is very good to see. And you can see here, both of them above the benchmark average, because I'm only looking at 2. If I were to expand this and look at 20, then you would see more of a range of numbers. Okay, here, I just wanted to show you what various industries look like. So looking at tech, consulting, and pharma, Merck is a company that, they have a lot of data. So they would be ones where, and actually they had to send a lot to me because I couldn't find it. And so, but my contact there was kind enough to send it. And I was like, wow, you should be communicating this data, in a different format so that people really know what you're doing in this space. I've had companies tell me, well, no, that data, we don't provide that, it's private. And I say, okay, well, but your competitor is providing it. So just to show you a way that they're using it to communicate what they're doing in this space. And I tell people, it doesn't matter the number. So don't get caught up in as a company saying, well, we only have 2% Blacks in leadership, so I want to hide it. Don't look at it like that. Look at it just like an organization that is selling you some new medication, and then they have to list all those side effects that are bad and terrible, but they have to list them nonetheless so that you as a consumer know what you're getting into. And at least that the organization, that company is trying to do what they can to reduce the pain or the severity of those side effects. But if they don't even make it transparent, you don't even know. So you can be taking medication and feeling bad and feeling sick and just wondering, what's wrong? I guess it must be something wrong with me. And no, maybe it's something wrong with the medication or the organization's lack of transparency. And so transparency is a good thing, because imagine you may be 2% Black in leadership, but if you're communicating with some historically disadvantaged groups and you're telling them, hey, we realize this number is low, and this is why we're talking to you, because we want you to help us to increase this number. And so we put in place a leadership development program specifically for historically disadvantaged groups, because we realize there are some different challenges that you're going to have to overcome in our workplace. And in addition to that, we're also looking at structurally, what practices do we need to change and adapt in order to be more receptive to people who look like you or come from your background. that is communication, that is leadership, that's management. And that's how an organization can use this tool. And that's how you as well can use this tool when you're working with an organization to extol the virtues of being transparent, even when it's ugly, right? All right. Other key benchmarks, looking at affinity, leadership development programs. So I want to do a comparison on that for the organizations that made that data transparent. And here we have, Merck. They provide a lot of good information on specific leadership development programs that they have. And more importantly, I thought they even provided on a turnover. And that's actually one of the things I look at in my scorecard. Very few companies give you information on turnover and even more so on turnover within their leadership development programs or their post, leadership development programs. So I thought that was very interesting. Now, wrapping up, when we think about data analysis, here's what you're looking at, okay? So you're looking at 4 types of analysis, but the first 2 here are looking at the organization. So you're gonna be looking at with this scorecard, the transparency and accountability as it pertains to the historically disadvantaged groups. But hey, it's not just about the organization, right? So you gotta turn that light on you as a career center, and you have to say, hey, what transparency and accountability do we have on participation rates of historically disadvantaged groups within our activities? So that's your career fairs, that's your one-on-one counseling appointments, that's your, career education workshops, that's your, experiential learning programs, anything that you as a career center are operating on. How many of you are tracking that data? How many of you have transparency around that data internally, right? And how, because if it's not transparent, you can't even be accountable on it, right? So that's something that we as Career Center also have to make available, because an organization may say, hey, but tell me what breakdown or what percentage of XYZ historically disadvantaged students attend these events that you want me to participate in, because we don't really want to get in front of these groups, in front of these workshops or do any type of information session if you don't even have this group even attend your events, because we're trying to get in front of that group. So again, these are the 4 types of analyses, right? And here are just some sample questions that you ask when you're building out this scorecard. You're asking simple questions that most part of companies already have available or can make available. But you're asking, hey, are you even tracking these demographics of your leadership, right? You're asking from a retention and advancement standpoint, are you a signatory of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion? Because there are a lot of top companies that are. So that's not a bad question to ask. It's not like it's something where it's offensive. You're just saying, hey, is your CEO, is your organization a part of this, where there are some top organizations who signed on, and that does mean something. Are you part of the Board Diversity of Action and Alliance, right? Are you leading the Corporate Diversity Council at your organization? And then when you look at community and social impact, you're asking, hey, are you tracking your progress with supplier diversity programs? And are you breaking it down by women-owned businesses and Black-owned businesses and Hispanic-owned businesses? Okay, very important questions to ask. Now let's get to your top 25 DEI companies as I wrap up. And we've got about 13 minutes. I'm gonna leave, I wanna leave at least 10 minutes for Q&A, or Teddy should be answering any of the questions in the chat. Don't be blinded by employee diversity rankings publications. So don't just say, hey, somebody's already vetted these companies as DEI best places to work, so I'll just use them. No, do the hard work, do this analysis, right? Set your institution's standards for what you feel the transparency and accountability should be for the employers that you do business with, especially as it pertains to ones you want to put in front of these types of students, right? Look at some of these leading companies like Pricewaterhouse, Bank of America, Microsoft, and JP Morgan. And what you want to look at when you look at that transparency spectrum that I created, you're going to have some companies that are at benchmark and above. And so you're going to slowly build your top 25 to 50 DEI companies. This is not created overnight, right? So don't think this is something you just do in one calendar year, but it's the start of how you start building over time to get those companies that you can attest to that have strong DEI practices. DEI, this is just a recap. So you can use this, as I call it, as the employer DEI readiness competencies, using career education workshops to train not only your historically disadvantaged students, but also your non-historically disadvantaged students. Hey, we need allies and advocates. So it's just not preaching to the choir. Everybody needs to understand their role in reducing inequities throughout society, in the workplace, and in academia. You can, from an academic standpoint, internally in your institutions, you can work with student enrollment and retention. You can support, the academic outcomes, working with faculty and all of that as well, in addition to the work you do in professional outcomes. And then you can use it as a guide to decision-making for the types of campus sponsors and partners that you really want to be aligned with, okay? And with that, I am going to end the presentation. Thank you very much.
Roderick, I think paying attention to the chat, people are loving what we just presented. Want to take any questions and feedback that people have. This could be a major game changer, and particularly, and shout out to Helen for her chat questions in the chat. But it can also internally look at your institution, right? I don't know who's all on the call, but I think I see Miami of Ohio University's on the call. You can internally use this for your own institution if you're part of a system, or for your own campus to do some internal lens perspectively as well. And so this is just not for employers, but also you can do for your own campus as well. So it's an opportunity, as Helen said in the chat, to bridge not only what you're doing on your office, but for your whole campus. But we're open for questions. And if there's no questions, that means we did a great job.
I'll take that. I'll take that. And feel free to email us as well. Now I realize I presented a lot of information, wanted to stay within the confines of the time that we had available. So I wanted to give you a high level overview, give you a taste of what it looks like, how it can be used, the work that you have to do individually and as an office or as an institution. But feel free to contact us and we can, discuss more in detail. I'll do a more extensive presentation, open presentation in January to go a little more in depth. But I wanted to make sure that for the purposes of this particular title and presentation, operationalizing equity and how to build out this scorecard, with employers to give you those key highlights.
So Roderick, there's a lot to think about. People are saying in the chat, obviously it's going to take some time. I would agree, reach out to us so we can help you. Our goal is to become the #1 career service office around diversity, equity, inclusion when it comes to this space and this work. So I challenge any of my colleagues on the call today or employers to definitely reach out to us and try to work in collaboration and support of this work moving forward. And I think it's wonderful and important. Shout out to Kennesaw State down there. And if you guys need some help, let us know. Definitely as far as that's concerned. So
that's a question, and put some things in the Q&A because I can see those as well.
Yes. So there's a question.
I asked a question here that was about the rubrics. I just wanted to give just a quick overview of rubrics. That's going to be according to your own career center and institutions. So that's something you can look at in terms of how you want to systematize and operationalize the way you evaluate the organization. So what criteria do you want to include in that rubric? And so that way you have an objective process, right? Without that, you can't operationalize it because then it's just too subjective. With the rubric, you can do it in collaboration with some key stakeholders internally within the career center or whoever has the knowledge of, hey, when I'm talking about looking at leadership or whatever benchmarks you're defining, what ways do I want to measure that based on the information that an organization makes available, right? And so you want to look at that because the rubrics is that's where your point systems are defined. And so with mine, for example, based on a rubric, you get 0 points, 1 point, 2 point, 3 points, right? But it's based on the rubric. So I look at the definitions in the rubric and I say, okay, well, this company has 2 years of data available and it's just aggregated by women, Blacks, Hispanics, so you get 3 points. Well, this company only has 1 year and it's disaggregated, so they get 2 points. With this company, it's not disaggregated, but they have some data. So they say, hey, 20% of underrepresented, employees are in leadership. So I say, okay, I'll give you a point because you do have some data. But then I had to create another measure. I had to say, well, I'm going to give you half a point if you have some qualitative data that you're just stating, yes, we have some, women and underrepresented minorities in leadership, because I found some organizations that had that. And so I wanted to be fair. So I've got to give you some points because that's not 0, but it's not quantitative. I can't really measure it, but at least you're telling me that you have that. And so now that sets the stage for me to have a conversation with you as an employer partner to say, hey, how cool would it be if you made that, data quantifiable, and I've had companies do that. I had companies say, oh, we got to, talk to our CEO and we got to reach out to some department. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know it was that deep and esoteric. I'm like, I'm showing the example of here's what other companies make available. So I'm not just requesting stuff just for the sake of requesting it. These are things that are important to me and would be important to the historically disadvantaged students that we're going to be talking with, because it is holistic. We're not just looking at you as an organization that recruits anymore. I think Dr. Bates made a great intro talking about that. We're looking at you from a holistic standpoint now. So it does matter to us. What are you doing in terms of, advocating for racial equality and social justice? Yes, that matters to us. It matters. What are you doing to support K through 12 education for historically disadvantaged groups? Microsoft does supports a lot of that with coding and things like that, based on their strengths, right? Yes, it does matter. Are you supporting supplier diversity and not just grouping it into this global underrepresented groups? Because I don't know what that means. So I want to see, is it disaggregated within the context of the US? Are you supporting the wealth building of these Black and Hispanic owned businesses within the community? Because otherwise we're going to perpetually be behind. Now, the CEO of Lowe's recently did a podcast and he talked about that they started a supply diversity program for Black and Hispanic and women-owned suppliers in the communities which they serve, because they realize the role they have as a major organization to be able to lift the boats of these smaller organizations that normally wouldn't get a chance. And so he spoke at length about the importance of doing that as an organization. Y'all heard about Bank of America and JP Morgan, like they're putting billions into these communities, and with these community development banks and all sorts of funds and nonprofits that advance the causes and missions of producing equitable outcomes across a number of areas that severely impact or negatively impact Blacks, women, Hispanics. When we talk about health and we talk about education, we talk about childcare, we talk about criminal justice. I mean, there are a lot of things where organizations can advocate for change that is going to show more of who they are beyond performative acts, and the type of companies that you would be proud to tell students from a historically disadvantaged group to, hey, you should investigate that organization. Or if we're going to have a speaker series, or we're going to do some type of event where we do some career tracks or whatever, hey, we would love it, for this organization to get in front of these students, because they're trying, they're really doing some internal change and they're showing it in the community.
Roderick, we got 3 quick questions. You got 1 minute per question. Real quick,
Go ahead.
Is, this scorecard is enormous. How is it tackled as a team from an announcement? And our good colleague down in Wilmington is asking the similar question. How are we beginning to do the research and contact employers with the DEI recruitment initiatives? I'll let you speak to that, and you got a minute.
Yeah. So in terms of workflow, the first thing you're going to, with the scorecard, since it's already created, then it's a matter, you can do 2 things. You can either look at organizations, see if they have a diversity report, or if they have sometimes it's included in the annual report, CSR report, sustainability report, citizenship report, ESG report. You get the picture, you see where I'm going. I mean, there's so many reports. So that's the harder method. And that's the method, that we did first, right? And so and that's good in doing that, because then you get to understand from a deeper level what it looks like in terms of information that's made available. Then the second way is just to simply ask, right? So you have a set of questions. I've got a question bank of probably over 100 questions now, but you strategically only ask a few just for the categories that you're trying to benchmark, and you just request this information from the organization. And sometimes they'll already have it in a report, and they'll say, oh, okay, we'll just send it to you, because yes, we do track that, but it just wasn't public for whatever reason. And then you can have another conversation about that. In terms of a team for analysis, it depends on how your team is constructed. So this could be something that lies within your employee relations team, or it could be broader, with your student-facing team to look at, because the student-facing team is key in terms of how they use this information to develop workshops and to educate the students on the merits of how we're evaluating these companies for specific events. And what was the other question?
Yeah, and we had interns to kind of help shape that as well. We had
interns to help. Yeah, so definitely had interns to help to do a lot of research. So otherwise, it would take 1 2 professionals. Like, it takes a long time. I've been working on this for like 10 to 15 years. So I already to set the framework for them to go do research on. But in terms of you're not going to do 100 companies overnight, and that's not the goal. The goal is to start building with the companies who have already engaged with you, and to start asking those questions establishing, put those in whatever rubric you define. When I'm going to, give this to the NACE community, so, the standard iteration, and I'll have instructions on how to use it, some examples of some rubrics. So, because just making the scorecard available by itself would be too difficult for anybody to just figure out how it works. But I'm going to provide that. I've already stated that I was going to, upload it to NACE after this presentation at some point, and with instructions. So I'm putting those together now so that a career center can say, hey, this is how we can use this for our own benefit, and here's some ways that are suggested to use it. So that would be answered within those materials.
And the last two questions real quick, Roderick. One which we expected to come up was around our LGBT community and populations.
Yep.
Scorecard, can you speak to that?
And again, so if we go back to the scorecard itself, when I told you the blank, let me see, this one for me and what we're looking at specifically the historically disadvantaged groups, women, Black, Hispanic. But I said, that's just our career center. Your career center, you may want to look at something different. So if you want to, look at other, spectrums of diversity, then that's up to your career center. So this is not a tool that says you only have to look at, these three categories. So you can expand it and look at what's important to you. What doesn't change, is these perspectives here, right? And so you can adapt some language so it fits whatever, groups that you're looking at, but it's not a tool. It is a tool that can be adapted for your purposes. But what I tell people is you have to start somewhere. If you try to look at every spectrum of diversity, this card is probably not for you because you're just not going to get anywhere. And so you do have to look at what are the groups that are really experiencing some challenges in measures and areas that you can identify some inequities, and because then you're better able to work with the organization and within your own academic institution, and that'll be different from every institution. So that's something that the institution or your department would decide.
And our last question, real quick, we can answer in 30 seconds. Speaking to vetting this rubric for organizations or higher institutions, it's really, like Roderick already laid out the framework for you as far as that is concerned, is creating your own reflection, your own change within the organization based upon those 4 areas, right? So Those 4 perspectives can be applied to an institution of higher education. Then you come up with your metrics, your rubrics to help you define that and move forward. So if you have a chief diversity officer, this is a great opportunity for you guys on the call to reach out to us to work with your chief diversity officer, because this could be used to help them in their role.
Yep. Think about a faculty member that creates their rubric when they're grading, test or projects. So you can create your own rubric. So there's not a esoteric, means, or it has to get vetted by the president or chancellor of the institution. No, like everybody on this call is, you can create a rubric. You can Google how to create a rubric. The thing is having a rubric that's consistent and objective. That's the key. I've done rubrics for a long time. I used to be a educator, used to be a K through 12 teacher, and I taught at university level. So I always had to develop rubrics, so teaching career education workshops. So I love developing rubrics just because they can standardize the process. So just find whoever is good at creating rubrics on your team, or do some LinkedIn learning or Google some examples, and then just come up with something that's objective that will allow you to standardize the way you measure the categories that are important for you.
Well, thank you guys for today. It has been an honor and privilege to be with you. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. Please give us feedback, fill out the evaluation, contact us if you need more support and help in this. Roderick is going to be sharing it from that perspective. Reach out. We are offering consulting services on this as well. So it's a unique opportunity for us to really change the outcomes that we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.